Well, hello and welcome everybody. This is Rebecca Caro for a Rowing Chat Special Extra. Today I'm joined by Martin Cross and Andy Triggs Hodge. Martin, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a lot older than Andy, for a start. I rowed before almost anyone that will be phoning up was born. So I was in the British team from 77 through to 94 continuously, which makes me Britain's second most capped ever rower behind Steve Redgrave. And in that time, I was lucky enough to drag Steve across the line to an Olympic gold medal. Don't tell him I said that. I've got a bronze medal too, and numerous other medals at various things, world championships. And I'm a bit of a rowing geek, and I commentate for rowing on FISA, and I do have a daytime job which actually pays the bills. I teach history, do a lot of writing about rowing quite often, and consultancy for a business training company in London. Married, 3 kids, life's good.
Fabulous. Andy, you can follow that one. Tell people a bit about you.
Good evening, morning, wherever you are. Yeah, I'm a rower. I'm hopefully about to embark on my 4th Olympics. I'm a lot younger than Crossy, but in the context of rowers, I feel very, very old. I'm lucky enough maybe to be double Olympic champion, which I don't say with any lightness. And I've had a varied and fulfilling career to date, and certainly probably about to embark on my greatest challenge. So yeah, live in Oxfordshire, 1 child, 1 wife. That's about it, really.
That's brilliant. And I'm Rebecca, and we're not talking about age because I'm a girl. I'm a masters rower and coach, and I currently live in New Zealand. I run Row Perfect UK, which, like Martin, it's a passion side project. The thing that pays the bills is a marketing consultancy. But what I particularly enjoy is connecting people who are into the sport of rowing. What I particularly enjoy is getting people talking about rowing and rowing topics. And today, I know that you two not only have got great opinions, you're also good talkers. So let's kick off. The thing that got us going on this quest to get together online was a comment made on Twitter about doing 2K tests on ergs. But it wasn't just 2K tests on ergs. It was speculation about whether or not they were being done on sliders. So let's just start by talking about erg testing in general. What's your view? Essential, inessential? Should we publish the results? What's different at international level? Andy, you've done a few.
Yeah. Erg tests are a very important part of training. They're an essential part of monitoring progress, of finding out things about athletes that you don't necessarily find out on the water. There's no hiding behind an ergo. When it's there, sat on the floor, all you have is that handle, the wheel, and the display. You've got nowhere to hide, and I think that's a very key part of the mindset of an athlete, especially a rower. You get into that mindset in the training every day, and then when it comes to test day, you really dial things up, and a lot of tension usually. People really fear it sometimes. Few people relish it. It's fair to say, but in terms of the bigger picture, it's an integral part of what we do as athletes. So therefore, it's reflective. Everyone compares their erg times. Everyone's making sure that what they've done before and what they want to do in the future sort of has that linear trajectory towards that sort of ever improving quest as an athlete. So. Yeah, absolutely. Integral part, really. I'm sure the machines evolve from time to time, and I'm sure Martin's going to harp on about the old Jessings. But yeah, that's probably my take on it so far.
Martin, harp on about some Jessings, would you? And just so you know, guys, a GJESSing was the very first commercially sold, I think, rowing machine.
Yeah. I
rowers
think it
use?
probably was. It was something which at the end of the 70s came into use. Generally, you had to go to a guy called Tor Nielsen, who's still a FISA consultant, and we first came across a jessing on a training camp in Spain in, I think, 1979.
That was the
And
squad, by the way.
yeah. Well, and I think the Pimenovs were out on the same training camp, the famous pair that raced for the Soviet Union, and they'd gone on the guessing, and we all had a go. And I think the notion was then, it was quite sweet really, that there was little connection between what you scored on the guessing and your rowing ability. In fact, we all just thought we were good rowers, and the guessing thing was just, oh, this looks like a bit of fun. I mean, in a sense, how naive we were to come in at the start of something. Because now it's very much a tool, not just in training, but also in selection. It is interesting, I think, and there are lots of stories about people who are not so good on the ergometer, but manage to move boats quite quickly. And, for example, GB has an ergometer standard, particularly for all its squads. I happen to know one lad, and I won't say his name, who is capable of beating a number of people trialling for GB. This is in juniors. But because his ergometer score is too slow, he can't get invited to trials. So he's quicker than some people in pairs in his squad. But the currency of ergos is so strong now that you have to try and get into it. And I know, Hodge, you'll know, like with Colin Smith, I mean, how close he got into your crew in 2008, but I know his ergo was, what was it, on 6 minutes or maybe just a little bit slower than that, but he was still in there for a seat in the 4 going head-to-head with Steve Williams then.
Yeah, that was an interesting time, and I definitely agree. I mean, on the flip side, kind of Tom James is the other example where you have a guy who's certainly not the strongest on the ergo, but the way he moves a boat, whether it's a pair 4 and 8, what he gives to the crew, so the confidence, the mentality-wise, and his attention to detail, he certainly not makes up for it, because that's sort of doing a disservice to his rowing, but his attributes were far stronger in other areas. And you're right, Martin. The ergo can be overestimated. It can be too big a picture on the when selecting crews sometimes.
Yeah, Alison Mowbray was another good example, who was very public about her inability to break 7 minutes, but she was an amazing athlete too.
I think from my side, the use of the ergo machine is definitely a tool to gauge personal development, and I think that's where at its best, whether you're a 6:15, a 6 minute, or a 5:50, 40 guy or girl, you're there to make sure each ergo is better than the last. You want to see that continual progression, and that's reflective on how you train, your attitude towards training, and then you see the rewards on these ergo tests. The problem is, and I think this is kind of where Martin's coming from, is that egos can tend to get in the way of ergos, in as much as we all get the list at the end of the day and you rank yourself next to your peers, and if you're down the list but it may be a PB, you may not feel as good as the guy who is way up on the list but actually didn't do as good an ergo. And you've got to take the confidence that if you improve and you make a step forward, no, it doesn't matter where you are on the list. Martin's absolutely right. If you perform at trials and actually you move a boat faster than anybody else, regardless of your ergo, then that's what selection should be based on, and that's why people get selected into crews. But for the individual, you really want to be making sure that you can progress your ergo scores, that your training works. It is that sort of measure, which I think the ergo has some power.
So that's all well and good. We're talking about testing. There's an enormous amount of psychology in it, but testing has to be standardized in order to be a fair and comparable test, and so that your score can be compared with the next person's. So what about testing on sliders? Andy, have you done a test on sliders?
I've never done a test on sliders. I've rode on sliders. I felt the difference it has. I've also used the dynamic and um, oh,
Do people
yeah, and I
know
think
what
I've used
sliders are?
Road Perfect a little bit. But there's definitely differences to sort of you see some people preferring different machines, etc. But
Yes,
going back to your point, the idea of standardization, so that if the egos want to fight it out, then there's one measure and there's one protocol which dictates actually yes that's the line, this is the goal, have you made it or not?
Martin, talk us through the different types of ergo.
Well, I wish I could do that better than Hodgie, but I probably can't because he's far more familiar with all of them than me. I've only used them occasionally. But so you correct me, Hodgie, if I'm wrong. But as far as I think, sliders are where you have a static ergo, which is where your slide moves up and down like in a rowing boat, and you compress. And most people will be familiar with those machines in the gyms. And what happens? You rest those on a kind of on tracks, and in effect, while you're going up and down in your seat, your ergometer is also moving along up and down on the tracks. And what that does is that creates quite a different feel and a sense of resistance, I guess a more vibrant feel. And my understanding is that if you were to do something like a 5K test, which is rowing hard for about, well, in Hodge's case, for probably about 15 minutes or so, or close to it, Andy, that actually, if you did it on sliders, you would score, maybe you would do it 10 seconds quicker, 5 kilometers, because of the different resistance. And then you have this very different ergometer called a dynamic, where the flywheel moves towards you as a cage, and you kind of stay where you are on your seat. It's a different relationship to yourself and the resistance in a static ergo, but also it's more forgiving, and people say it's more like a boat. If Eric Murray was online now, he would say he rows the dynamic because it's more like a boat feel. And I guess he would say that the sliders feel more like a boat too. So that's my take, Hodgie, but I might have got that wrong.
No, there's a lot of agreeable facts there. I think the one point to mention is that in a dynamic and an ergo on sliders, the big difference between those two those two rowing machines and a normal static ergo is that it's the weight distribution. So on a static ergo, you have to move your weight up and down the slide. So for a 100-kilo guy, you have to change the 100 kilos twice a stroke. So one at the catch, one at the finish. When you're on a static ergo on sliders or a dynamic, it's actually the cage or the machine that you're changing the direction of. So with sliders, your machine weighs about 14 kilos. That's the amount of energy you need to expend to change the direction of the machine. So you can rate a lot higher, and that's the same with the dynamic, except the cage density on the dynamic weighs about 5 kilos. So you have even less resistance, which means you can rate even higher. And then when you translate that to a 6-minute test or a 15-minute test, you save a lot of energy by just moving the machine versus a static ergo where you have to move your whole body weight.
So that's a really good point about the weight and the mass. And I'm not a physicist, although I come from a family of physicists. But if we consider that the ergo is, at least in some part, analogous to moving a rowing boat, a single scull with its oars and riggers weighs about 17 kilos. If you're in an 8, your share of an 8 is probably down to about, help me out, 14, 12 kilos per man has to move the boat. So there is something very real about having to move the mass of something else as well as your own body weight when you're in a rowing boat. Do you think that's fair?
Well, as I understand it and as I feel it, a dynamic ergo feels more like the resistance when you row than a static ergo. It's easier to find the resistance on a static ergo, I think, certainly than it is in a rowing boat. So that would be. So and also I understand that it's less resistance on your lower back.
Yeah.
And I did hear a stat, I think, in one of the big squads, I won't mention which one, that out of about 30 athletes in an Olympiad, there were probably just 6 who didn't have back issues or something addressed with their back. So I think there would be arguments for testing on dynamics, or for looking at tests on dynamics, but I think you get so much data on the static that you just want to test on the static.
Certainly, my understanding from the coaches that I speak to is the wealth of data from years and years gone by has meant that they are very unlikely to change their testing mechanism. And just to confirm what you said, Martin, about the strain on your back, yes, Alison McGregor and other people have done sports science researches about the load on the lower back, and it is significantly less on a dynamic.
One thing that's interesting is for example, the British 8 that won in 2000 trained every day on row perfect ergos, which is a kind of a dynamic ergo type machine. And that was, in a sense, to recapture a sort of feel that they were doing in a boat. And I know quite a few coaches, a minority, like the row perfect machine and say that it reproduces a feel that they want their rowers to get in a boat. So I don't really know how to use it. That as a coach, either of them as a rower, I'm not that good to be able to use it in that way. But that's certainly what I've observed and heard and what coaches have said to me.
Yeah, I think there's one other thing to add into there regarding which machine you would use to test. There's another argument, which is actually the robustness of the machine. If you're using a static ergo on sliders, the sliders itself, unless they're in good nick and repaired the whole time, the elastics go, the runners get gritty, so you add in a level of uncertainty, which, if you train on it the whole time and they're well maintained, will be fine, but it's another layer of duties that someone has to do. And equally with the dynamic, a big limitation from that machine is that the cable, because it can't be a chain, it has to be a fabric nylon cable, that actually snaps a lot. And I've seen a lot of athletes going on for some big strokes where it snaps quite frequently, and it's if we talk about back damage, then that's actually quite concerning. So I would certainly highlight those 2 points. And then also on the lower back point, if you think about changing the core you need to change the direction of a 100-kilo entity. So Martin, when you're on the ergo, okay, you're what, 70 kilos, 75?
Yeah, me and Martin.
I wish.
You'll have to change that direction
88.
to the ergo, whereas on the dynamic, you don't have to change that direction. Your legs can actually just pick up the resistance on the machine, having only changed 14 kilos. And again, that's the impact on the lower back, and why the lower back is much more vulnerable.
Good stuff. So I'm going to wrap up on. I'm going to wrap up on our chat around ergos, unless there's any final last points. But I think we're going to make a guess that stonking score that's got slipped out on Twitter the other day was one of your crewmates, Andy. I take it you're not claiming it for yourself.
I'm absolutely not claiming it for myself. No, it was an absolutely enormous thing to witness. But true to the gentleman's character, he's not one to shout his head off. He certainly doesn't let his ego get in the way, and I sort of credit to his character. You know, he keeps his sort of head on his shoulders, and I think, to be honest, that's what's going to make him an Olympic champion at the end of the day. So, no, I will back him to the hilt on what he did, but also his approach to how he did it and afterwards as well. Let's
talk Olympics. It's a gigantic year. I'm obviously hoping every single broadcaster is going to sign me up as a commentator, and I will be there in Rio as a spectator. But rowing at the Olympics is definitely being discussed at the highest levels in many ways. FISA has presented 3 separate potential formats because they are being pushed towards inclusivity and equality of head count of men and women. Martin, you read the details from FISA and you have put forward some suggestions of your own as to what would make rowing at the Olympics a greater sport than it already is. Tell the listeners what your ideas are.
Well, I think it's important to add that you know, from someone who does the sport really at masters level now, I have changed the views from when I was an athlete, where I was actually quite fiercely defensive of what I would say is a fairly traditional system. So men's events, women's events, 14 boat category, and also defensive of, you know, my own nation and others like it, Germany and Britain. So a lot of events which those big countries could fill up. I've changed that view now. I see the changes that FISA are putting forward, for example, the elimination of the lightweight 4 as being window dressing, and really doing something to, I guess, appease the International Olympic Committee, who are telling FISA we don't understand lightweights and we don't understand why the lightweight 4's there. So I think this is a chance to do something to make the sport more interesting, covered more widely, and to that end, I would want to have the prime event of the sport, the men's 8, open to far more countries than currently do it. So I think the only way to achieve that is for countries, for example, like Norway, who could never, you know, really put an 8 together because they don't have the number of rowers, or Belgium, is to have a kind of 2-stage Olympic regatta where you have small boats, singles, doubles in the first part, and perhaps on the second part building up to a quadruple, and the same with sweep rowers, so you kind of have pairs and 4s, and those rowers build up to an 8. So you'd have less rowers in your teams because you don't need as many as the big teams, so less people would get national selection, which would be cheaper. You'd have probably less people in the Olympics, so rowing would take up less numbers that would also be cheaper, which would be attractive to the IOC. But you'd have great racing, you'd have more numbers, more heats. I would also introduce mixed crews, because I think that is something which is possible. It would be attractive, it would be really great to try. I would like to keep lightweights in the sport if at all possible. It wasn't what I thought in 1992 when they were first mooted, but I think whole countries have built their program around lightweight rowing. I think it would be fairly disastrous for some programs if that were to change. Mm-hmm. But my essential thing is, and I would really like, so for example, I think rowing ought to have, at an Olympics, say, for example, like Boston, which really pulled out because it didn't want the financial expense and the drain of hosting an Olympic Games. I would see that, you know, what you could have had an Olympic competition like the Head of the Charles through the centre of Boston, which would be an amazing thing if you had an Olympic competition on that river in the middle of Boston, which would necessitate, if you like, a time trial like the Head of the Charles is. I think the sport, it would be good for the sport to have the flexibility to alternate, or you know, as appropriate, to show off different aspects of the sport. So it's not just 2,000 metre rowing, and for that to be known in advance. I would also bring in indoor rowing into the Olympics as part of the family of Olympic medals. So I would have indoor rowing competitions, which would be open to more rowers to make the sport more accessible to more people, and go on from there. So a lot of ideas. I don't think any of those things are going to happen, by the way, because we are a conservative sport. But that's what I would like.
Andy, what's your view on this?
Yeah, on the first level, I completely agree with Martin. Using the 8 as a relay event, much like in athletics, the 4x100, 4x4, it strikes a very good balance between the tradition and the performance, the kind of the quest for um, uh, athletes getting closer and closer to their ultimate performance levels, and pulling it back and say, well, actually, look, here's performance, but actually, here's something fun. Here's something where you will get unexpected results. Crews will click, crews won't. It would be awesome to see the Kiwi pair in a Kiwi 8 and see what they can do. I think those prospects would help bring the sport alive. It would create the unknowns that would generate some really intriguing racing. Results we'd never think of would be happening, year on year. And I completely agree. It would also offer absolute parity between gender, because a lot of nations will be able to have 8 men and 8 women competing in those events. So your gender issues would be dealt with. It might be difficult for developing nations to get really involved with it. So they currently rely on the singles and the lightweight singles to gain access into the Olympics. So it shouldn't be mandatory that every nation has to, but it's certainly there as an option. And kind of if you want to race the 8, then it has to be part of a wider program. So yeah, I completely agree. I think within the current sort of atmosphere and opportunity, I think that's definitely a way forward. I know I completely agree about and actually put onto the water for right in the centre of towns and cities. There's always waterways, whether it be lakes, pleasure lakes, rivers, oceans, that sort of neighbour these big cities. And I think you look at arguably the biggest rowing event in the world is the boat race, and it's held on a river. There's no buoys. There's one guy with a flag telling one of the crew to get out of the way, and it produces some excellent racing. The women's boat race this year is the point in case. It was absolutely fantastic to watch the crews darting all over the river, trying to find the best bit of water, and one crew nearly said, "Oh, he's just fantastic to watch." And then you look at the head of the Charles, and its format is what people fear is a boring time trial event. But you look at how they're turning that around. They're creating something much bigger than the event itself. They're using the rowing as the centerpiece. It's right there. Everyone wants to go to the head of the Charles. It is bona fide, the biggest open regatta there is in the world. And I think FISA has a great case study there to learn from, and a base of confidence to actually instigate those things. Crossy says, he's skeptical they'll ever happen, but things only won't happen because there's a fear actually it might fail. Well, there you go, guys. It works. Go out and do it. And I think for the Olympic movement, it does need to. We do need to generate a lot of things outside of gender equality and diversity. We actually have to seriously address income and the cost to the Olympics that rowing has. We can't survive without sponsors. There's a pretty good reason why the Olympics has invited those 3 new sports, of which one is golf and one is rugby. It's because they bring a lot of money into the sport and into the Olympics itself. They can court those big sponsors for the Olympics themselves. And my fear is that unless we're addressing those issues more seriously, then we could be as gender equal as we like or diverse across as many countries as we like, but we still will have that threat hanging over us that actually we just cost too much to run in the Olympic Games, and no amount of tradition will probably save us in the long run. So no, I agree with Crossy. I think there's some great ideas out there. Come on, FISA, be brave, see the new world. Let's go for it.
That's fabulous points. And one of the comparisons to a traditional Olympic sport that I think can usefully be made is cycling, particularly the indoor cycling, where they've invented new events, the Madison, the Kirin, the Pursuit, all of these things could easily be mimicked on something like either indoor rowing or relay style racing, which, as you pointed out, can be done on shorter bodies of water. Martin, you went to the Serpentine Regatta. Do you remember that back in the day, televised in the middle of Hyde Park?
Well, I organised it actually with a group of Hampton School parents. I was on the board that ran it, you know, it was. I think it was a brave new world in a sense. I think there've been several dawns of that. I think the format of city centres is good, but really, you know, it was in the middle of Hyde Park. The crowds weren't big. I think the essential ingredient is television. David Goldstrom, who, as you probably know, Rebecca, as a broadcaster, he introduced the DAF Sprint series, and I know Hodge was very close to getting a great event going in Osterley Park in West London last year. Yeah. Super Sprint. So I do think that's an attractive model, and I do think it's got a lot going for it. And you know, we had 3 fun years with Channel 4 and the sponsors of Westminster City Council, and I think then the London Electricity Board. But the momentum we couldn't sustain it, and it was the money really that that ran out.
One of the things that in Great Britain, I mean, we're all from the UK, but one of the things in Great Britain that has changed since they built the Dorney Lake and since they held a couple of World Cups and obviously a World Championship and an Olympics there, is that in Britain, you know, you can bring a crowd to a rowing event nowadays. We're all much more connected online. There are queues down the M4 whenever you have a big event at Dorney Lake that involves rowing, and I'm sure that the same can be said at other venues. So if I were an event organizer and you had the backing of the rowing community, I wouldn't have any doubts about bringing the audience in. Do you think that that's a changing thing in Great Britain, that people are now more prepared to come out and watch the stars race?
This is an interesting one. I think you're right. I think people will come and watch rowing, especially if it's delivered on a high enough level. The World Cups that were ran in Dorney were fantastically attended. I mean, much like the Carapira Worlds, you know, you got a sense there was a big local rowing population that would be willing to, you know, participate on a spectator level. And I think there are lots of opportunities. The challenge is, you know, my kind of experience with the row sprints was actually how do you get a new population of rowers to see a different angle of the sport, get them engaged, and develop that to a big enough level to make it a sustainable arm in our rowing family. So, you know, Martin was saying how the DAF sprints only lasted for 3 years and then the money ran out. So my approach was more trying to get ground up development into sprint rowing, so we could see actually something strong and bottom up, sustainable development of sprint rowing. The problem we had was we went up against what is a very now structured full program of traditional 2K racing. And we found it very hard to squeeze in the gaps so that we could give opportunities to people in small boats just come down kind of off their own back and just participate, much like a cycling event. And actually that's where I learned the biggest lesson. I think, you know, rowing isn't a cycling type sport or a swimming sport. You can't just get your boat on your roof and go to a regatta. Clubs are the most dominant feature of rowing, whether it's university clubs, you know, clubs in the UK. They're all based around coaches, a squad, and in that light, we need to start comparing rowing to sports like rugby or football. You know, we need to, if we want to see development in the sport at the grassroots level, we actually need to start empowering our boat clubs to take the necessary steps to move the sport forward. And I think with that, we then grow the sport on that spectator basis that you're talking about. We have liberalised a lot of people to actually connect with rowing better, Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc. And to provide those events, to provide more local-based matches. The Oxford-Cambridge matches are still some of the best attended events on a rower per spectator basis, with the boat race obviously capping out everything. And if we can liberate that audience, get people down to watch the races, I think that's where we could see a real development from the bottom-up approach. So yeah, I think there's a huge market out there. We just have to kind of find the keys to get there.
So in Germany, in every sport, they have something called a Bundesliga, and every state competes. And rowing has a Bundesliga as well in sprint format, which they do in town centres. And clubs participate, and I think I'm correct in saying there's quite a substantial cash prize for the people who, get to the finals, because it's an elimination contest. So, Andy, when you talk about empowering clubs, and let's be very frank here and talk money, are we talking about paying clubs to attend events in the same way that football or rugby has television rights, which then get distributed back to the clubs as part of their participation?
Essentially, yes. I think if you were to translate a rugby model onto rowing, you would have Molesey versus London on such and such weekend, and on the same weekend you'd have Leander versus Thames. You'd have those. We kind of step away a little bit from the regatta formats of everyone turning up to one event, and actually spread it out a bit so that all the people from Molesey would turn up when London came to visit. London spectators would come down with their banners and flags, and they'd all be standing on the bank shouting and cheering. What would be probably like an hour or 2 hour format, so it's short, sharp. Once you got that going, the sponsor would come along, whether it's a local company who wants to raise their profile or something more wider, I don't know, but it creates a value. When people go to watch something, you have a value to sell. If that was a league, you're then actually creating something bigger than each individual match. You can then grow the sport and create the league that people can countries. Or did you hear Molesey to Thames the other day? Oh, it's such a close race. They lost it on the sprint section. Oh God, you should have seen it. They caught a massive crash. That's the kind of atmosphere we want to start exposing rowing to. That kind of passion and energy, which does get a bit lost on a 2K course. We're also professional. We don't catch crabs anymore. We don't. We sort of deliver what we're expected to deliver, and that's great for performance. I rely on it every day for my lottery grant. But what does it deliver to the spectator? Well, my family, my friends, they want to see me win, of course. But does it make them excited? Does it really do something more than just what I'm trying to achieve? I think that's where we can go if we're inside the box. Yeah.
If I could come in there, Rebecca.
Go for it.
Well, one of the issues of the sport is we've got a sport that's dominated by, I think, by the coaches and the athletes in terms of everything is subordinated to World Championship success and Olympic success. So, for example, we had a World Cup regatta this weekend in Varese, and the sport has hardly, any racing profile in the world at all. It has like 3 World Cups, 2 European Championships, and then the Olympic Games. But in a sense, the point that coaches want to train. So Hodge is on camp in Aviz. The Germans were doing their thing, off the back of a training camp racing in Cologne. The French didn't turn up. I know there's issues around, the European Championships, but which the French aren't even going to, or the new French double. So coaches have control, and they don't want. So typically there ought to be a World Cup in between Lucerne and the World Championships, where you've got this 6-week wait where the sport goes to absolute sleep. You have a few championships that people are interested in, like juniors and under 23s, but don't catch any media attention, not even on telly. And really, the sport ought to be racing in that period, like athletics, but you can't have it because the coaches say we want to do our training preparation, and there's a kind of contradiction there between what's holding the sport back and what would make it more progressive. And I don't know the answer because the big federations have the votes in world rowing, and that's where the coach's power sits.
That's a really interesting point, and it also mitigates against making any changes, because you can imagine the panic if one of your kind of new sprint formats was admitted and the coaches realizing that in a year or 4 years they were going to have to completely change everything. And full respect to the coaches, they get paid to deliver, and boy do they deliver. But the attractiveness of the sport to a viewing public who themselves are not practicing the sport is, I think, the biggest challenge to rowing. As a person myself who I knew nothing about rowing except the boat race until I went to university, and now I'm in a local club, and we find that people want to learn to row as adult beginners because they have seen it on telly, or because their kids have taken it up, or because of the Olympics and so on. And that's where the growth area and participation is. But the difference between that and soccer and rugby is that lots of people watch soccer who don't themselves play. And I think the interestedness of the racing format is clearly and surely something that has to be challenged if we're going to bring in the dollar, which, Andy, would then support your sprint format.
Yeah, indeed. Spot on points in my book. The way I look at the sport, or sport in general, on one end of it you've got strict performance, and the other end of it you've got spectacle. So if strict performance is, say, kind of where I think rowing's at, so you kind of forgive everything for that one performance, that one event at the end of the year, nothing else matters. And then you run it to the other side, is purely the spectacle. It's kind of more like watching someone's skateboard tricks or BMX stuff. There's no real event around it. It's just actually watching somebody do something pretty amazing, which is just really cool to watch. It's still sport. You train for it and you work at it, but it's very far away from kind of a performance level. And I think we need to look at rowing where it is on that spectrum. Perhaps we've gone a bit too far down the line about strict performance. How do we bring ourselves back a little bit? And you look at football, and there's both. Rugby's the same. A lot of sports are middle ground. They have to perform. They have to be fit and strong and technically good. But there's that spectacle. There's that unknown element. Football classic, you just don't know. Who would have guessed that Leicester City would be, heading up the Champions League right now?
Yeah.
So you need to find that platform where that can develop. And we all have a go at footballers for not being the fittest or the strongest people because they play so often, and therein lies the rub. They're a big sport because they offer so much of the spectacle every week, day in, day out, between all the clubs of the Premiership. They're always sort of delivering that spectacle, and then behind it, the coaches are there to deliver as much performance as they can squeeze in. But everyone's equal because everyone's committed to the same program, and there is FISA's responsibility. It's only FISA that can really take that decision and enforce it across the sport. And if it were to make the decision and everyone was to buy into it, then the same concerns would exist with the coaches. Are we fast enough, strong enough, etc. But it'd be within the context of, are we strong enough and fit enough to perform this weekend, and the weekend after that, and the weekend after that? And the sport would take a huge evolutionary step. But the big risk, and I think the one why it's so contentious to discuss these sorts of things, is that what would that mean for the Olympics?
Yeah.
And the bottom line is that you would demote the Olympics within the rowing program, because it would be reliant on a league through the year rather than one event in the Olympic timetable. And because of that, you then risk your association with the games. FISA's, the IOC and FISA's headquarters are only like 100 to 200 meters apart from each other. They rely enormously on each other. If you start talking about these sorts of formats, you're then going to erode that partnership, which is why personally I don't think we'd ever really get down this line unless something pretty catastrophic was to happen, like rowing got chucked out of the games.
Martin, what do you think?
Well, I mean, never say never. I mean, I'm thinking when's the last athletic competition before the Olympic Games? I can't think it's 6 weeks before, or the last swimming competition. I mean, like Bradley Wiggins is coming from the Tour de France to the Olympics, like it was a week apart, I think. I mean, that would be heresy in rowing. I just think, I can imagine, right? So you do Lucerne, you have a 3-week break or a 2-week break, you have another World Cup, rowing's in the public, eye in the summer, and then you might, you have 3 or 4 weeks for your World Championships. That's what I'd like, but the votes would only come. FISA could only get that if the federations voted for it, and the big federations like the British Federation or the German Federation, they just wouldn't buy it. So ultimately, I mean, the federations are who you have to convince.
Too true, too true. I want to wrap up just with one final little point, which is utterly essential if any of the changes that you guys have kindly shared with us today are going to happen, and that's the fans. So we had a brief chat about whether or not the selection trials regattas should be open to the public, and in Great Britain they're private, open to the press only. In places like New Zealand they're in public, and in fact the public get day sheets and they get told exactly who's racing whom and what the results of the race times are. If we don't bring the fans along with us, none of these things are going to happen. So without going down a big rabbit hole, let's start with trials, selection regattas. Should they be open to the fans? What do you reckon, Andy?
Yeah, I do. We're all looking for narratives. The media, our press officers, they want to sort of hang a story on something. One result at a World Cup doesn't mean much if you don't know really who's racing. And the best narrative is how the people got there. Knowing that they're from, Essex County, from this little village. It's nice to know, I guess, but what's the meat and guts behind why that person's in that boat? Who do they have to fight to get there? And I think the rich stories that exist within British rowing behind the scenes it's frustrating. Like, there's some really amazing stuff. There's some amazing stories of people going through hardships, coming back from adversity, performing well above and beyond their expectations and their coaches' expectations. It would be phenomenal. But, again, it's that same old story, performance or spectacle. For a coach, he needs to protect that information because actually it might give the opposition something to chew on. There's so much going on that the more they can control, the better for their own ends, the better for that one event at the end of the year. So no, I think they should all be open. I know there's a few restrictions within British rowing because Caversham can't be used as an open event, and Dorney's too expensive, and Nottingham's too far away. It's not completely simple, but they need to work on it. They need to address that because it's a goldmine.
Of course, you could retire and then write a book called Olympic Obsession. Hasn't that been done before, Martin?
Yeah, only once. Took 4 years of my life, and a lot more probably.
You promised there were a lot more stories to come, actually, Martin. You told me that once. But Volume 2.
Well, I'm currently working on a book about a rower who lived 100 years ago. He was an amazing musician, a man called F.S. Kelly. Won the Diamonds 3 times. He won Olympic gold medal for Britain, even though he was Australian. And he was an incredible composer and musician. So that's my latest project. But there may be more modern things to come when that's finished.
That's wonderful. Gentlemen, you've both been amazing. Thank you very much for giving up your time, for joining us on Rowing Chat today. I've had a blast. I seriously hope that we can make some of the things that you've brought to the fore that you're prepared to discuss into wider discussions with wider groups of people. I'll certainly be asking young Daniel, who tweets at Fat Sculler, to do his best to help us to amplify the discussion, because a discussion does need to be had, and it does need to be had between the fans, the sport organisation and the athletes. Before we leave, let the listeners know where they can get in touch with you. If you want me, I'm at Rebecca Caro or at RowPerfect on Twitter. Martin.
I am at Mart Crossy, MartCrossy.
And I am at Andrew T. Hodge on anything from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Periscope, but I haven't ventured into that one yet, so watch this space, eh?
I'll Snapchat you later, because I am also on there. Thank you very much, everybody, and we will have another informal rowing chat. Watch your inboxes. I'll send out notifications to anyone who's on the Row Perfect mailing list.